I want to finish off today's lecture by talking about, by coming back up to the modern era and talking about how this happened. So I mentioned at the beginning that most Native people today actually live in urban centers. And so we have to ask ourselves, how does that happen? Why does this stereotype about Native people living in reservations still so persistent? And how do we get to the place where that isn't the case anymore? Because maybe 100 or even 75 years ago, it may have been the case that most Native people were living on reservations, but that's not the case anymore. And so we can try and tackle this question of how that happened. And so we'll talk about the most important legal and social movements that did encourage this movement to urban centers, the termination and relocation policies of the first half of the 20th century, effects of those. So the first is the termination policy, one of the arguably most destructive legal steps taken against Native people in the history of colonialism of the United States. In the 1930s and 40s and into the 50s, basically the United States decided they really wanted to, the quote I hear often is, quote, get out of the Indian business. They were hoping to try and terminate the tribal relationship, the longstanding relationship between tribes and the state, the United States. And in order to break that cycle, what they essentially did was terminated many recognitions, made it very difficult for new recognitions to come up, and they also broke up reservation landscapes and gave away huge portions of reservation lands. And it's not a coincidence that this happened at a time when the population of Native people in the U.S. was probably at its lowest, with maybe in the tens of thousands of Native people still living on reservations at that time. So this is when they kind of make this move, and so some estimates suggest that around 1.5 million acres of land was taken from Native people during the termination policies, and that this probably affected many thousands of individuals. The termination policies were coupled with a set of relocation policies, and so the ultimate goal of this was to try and get Native people off the reservations and get them to integrate into broader American society. And so the government at that time felt the best way to do that was to encourage Native people to move to cities, to city centers. And so a number of cities around the country, Denver and Los Angeles and I'm trying to think of some, St. Louis, it's kind of an unusual group of cities, but a lot of Western cities especially became destinations to move Native people off their reservations and onto these new spaces. And so we see advertisements like this one going up all over the country. Some money was put aside that was supposed to, pay for a bus ticket and get you set up in an apartment and get you some job training and maybe hook you up with a job to start. But there's a lot of evidence that many of these things didn't really happen, and that the conditions where when Native people arrived in the cities were really less than ideal. But nonetheless, many thousands of Native people do move away from the reservations, sometimes without a choice, because their reservations were being terminated. And they move into urban centers, and they found new urban communities. The motivation for these policies was, on its face, a positive motivation to, this quote is one that's mentioned often and is not a good quote, but to, quote, kill the Indian to save the man. We'll talk about some the boarding school movement later in the course, and we'll see how that also had these motivations, and like that, that may have been the motivation, but the outcome was quite ill for most Native people. It was supposed to civilize Native people and integrate them, and also provide them with new economic opportunities. But a more pessimistic interpretation of the relocation policies was that it was an avenue to land theft and a destruction of sovereignty, and it certainly did have those effects. Whether those were the motivations, I'm not sure, but those were certainly the effects. Huge numbers, as I said before, and over 1 million acres of land was reabsorbed from reservations, and many tribes lost their recognition status, which was definitely a hit to their sovereignty overall. The effects today is that roughly 2/3 of Native people do live in urban areas. So, way more than half of Native people live in urban areas. And those folks over time found each other. And it was in these urban environments with Native people from all over the country all living together and meeting each other and creating community centers and creating a kind of new urban identity, a shared Native American identity, which becomes kind of known as pan-Indianism, kind of the notion of there being a Native American identity at all, or an American Indian identity at all. Before this, identities were much more tribal. You thought of yourself as Pomo or Pequot or Lakota. You didn't see yourself as Native American or American Indian. And so I think from the urban movements, we see the development of these shared identities, and with that comes I think an unexpected result from these policies was the founding of the civil rights movement, because in these shared communities and urban centers, from those is really where the occupations of Alcatraz, the occupation of Wounded Knee, the occupation of the other occupation movements of the time period, a lot of that Native activism, most of it in fact, did not come from reservation communities, but rather came from these urban communities of Native people living together and feeling like they needed to defend their rights. So if you haven't yet, and you watch A Good Day to Die, you'll see some evidence of this, that it was really from these urban communities where we see AIM, the American Indian Movement, emerge, and other groups like that. And the achievement of a lot of their civil rights goals comes from these communities. So we see a new identity, a new shared identity come from these urban spaces.